John Stuart Mill was the godson of Jeremy Bentham and was inspired by his work. However, he disagreed with some of Bentham's applications of utilitarianism. Specifically, it can be said that Mill noticed the difficulty arising from Bentham was that he permitted any act as long as it produced maximum happiness. This causes a problem because it does not protect the happiness of the minority. For example, if a group of 10 sadistic guards were to wish to torture one prisoner, the hedonic calculus values all pleasure equally and allows only for the quantity of happiness. Thus, the guard's happiness outweighs the prisoner's pain, and this leads to actions that we would normally consider to be immoral. Mill hoped that his version of utilitarianism would solve this kind of difficulty. Mill's description of the utility principle runs thus. He claimed that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. Mill, as Bentham, was a hedonist in the sense that what is good is what makes people most happy. However, one big difference between Bentham and Mill is that Mill took a qualitative approach to the assessment of pleasure and pain. He did actually feel there was a difference in the types of pleasure or pain experienced, and that they take on a different value as a result. He claimed that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Here he was trying to say that the things that distinguish us from the rest of the animal kingdom, the qualities that make us human, are the things that we should seek out, not just things that make us happy, but things that make us human. This challenges the accusation by Thomas Carlyle that utilitarianism was no more than pig philosophy, pandering to our most basic instincts and desires. Mill distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. He felt that some pleasures were certainly more basic, and these he categorised as pleasures of the body. These are the more instinctive pleasures, those that can be shared by other members of the animal kingdom, and that we could sacrifice, if we chose, for the acquisition of a higher pleasure. However, lower pleasures are considered by Mill to be necessary to some extent, since they are the desire for food, sex, warmth, and so on. We do need them, but they do not mark us out as being anything other than part of the animal kingdom, and thus Carlyle's challenge stands. However, higher pleasures are what Mill considered to be of higher value. They are pleasures of the mind. The intellectual pleasures, reading, making music, science, philosophy, and so on, and these are what make us human, and they are different from the lower pleasures that anyone can achieve. They require the lower pleasures to be fulfilled, but we would potentially sacrifice those lower pleasures to achieve the higher. For example, the artist that struggles to make ends meet but does so in order to continue their art. In terms of who gets to decide which pleasures are higher and which are lower, Mill thought that the intellectual, the philosopher, was the best place to do so, since he or she had access to both kinds of pleasure and so was better placed to decide. Another way in which Mill differed from Bentham is in his assessment of rules. He developed the harm principle in order to protect the interests of the weak and the minorities who were not protected under Bentham's variation. He felt that whilst the individuals should be free to do whatever they like if it makes them happy, this should not be at the expense of happiness and well-being of others. Thus, rules needed to be developed in order to limit the freedom to do harm. This should prevent the problem of the sadistic guards, since the prisoner is protected against the exercise of their happiness. Essentially, this is a form of rule utilitarianism, although Mill did not characterise himself as such. He felt that rules should be made, not so much to limit freedom, but purely to protect the vulnerable. He felt that rules made should reflect our moral obligation to do no harm, but beyond that it was a matter for the individual to decide what should be done. Any action is permitted provided it does not cause harm to others. For example, then, any decision made by Beth or Anchor regarding their pregnancies may be their own personal choice up until it has the potential to cause harm to another being. Since an abortion might be seen as potentially harming another being, it may be that an abortion would be forbidden under rule utilitarianism if the unborn child was a person to be protected. If it was not, then both Beth and Anchor are free to do what they want. However, it might be worth noting whether or not there is potential harm to anyone else if abortion were to be allowed. If it is not a private matter because of the involvement of medical staff, then their well-being needs to be considered in the equation too. In addition, it must be considered how far this affects the higher and lower pleasures of the girls. Since Beth is still at school, if her schooling were to be adversely affected by the pregnancy, then she should be allowed to not continue this pregnancy, since the academic pursuits are what make us human. However, if schooling or higher pleasures are not affected or even enhanced by the pregnancy, then it should continue. Since we should be making a rule rather than weighing it up individually, we could say that forcing a person to continue a pregnancy against their will might constitute harm, and thus abortion should be allowed if the mother wants it. However, we could also say that abortion itself constitutes harm, both of the fetus and of the mother through having the procedure. Ultimately, if no harm can be proven, then the girls are free to do as they please.